What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be doing an Alchemy box. Now, I had a lot of fun modeling this over the weekend and I could have easily spent another few hours adding little details, and there's definitely a few things that I wish I could have added that I just didn't have enough time to do, and I'll go over those later on in the video, but either way I'm really happy with how it turned out and I hope you guys enjoy. So without further ado, let's just get started. So to start things off, I'm going to select the cube and start blocking out the main shapes. Now I'm going to start off with the case because it's the largest object in the scene, and then I can work my way on to everything else. Now I'm not going to worry too much about getting everything perfect right off the start. It's going to need some refining and changing in shape as other objects come into the scene, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. I'm just going to start roughly blocking things out and then we can refine them as we go. So I'm just going to let the next little bit play out, as that's all I'm going to be doing, is just blocking out these shapes. Alright, so the main box shape is all blocked out. Now we can start moving on to the side little door. So that's going to be the exact same process as we just did. I'm just going to start blocking out that shape, and I can start beveling things out and refining it as we go. Alright, so now I'm going to start beveling some edges, and then I'm going to go create that little metal piece that helps keep all these wood pieces together. Now the proportions don't matter too much since I'm not going to see this thing opening and closing, but just to make sure it's not too far off, I'm just going to move this thing towards the center of this object just to make sure that the size is relatively close. Alright, so we have those side doors in place. Now I'm going to start refining these shapes a little bit further and start beveling out some of these edges. Now, this isn't completely necessary depending on what your model is going to be used for. In this case, it's just going to be a little bit higher in poly. I just want to do a couple cool shots and renders, so I'm not too worried about the poly count. So I'm just going to start beveling some of these edges and start adding a few more polys to the scene. Alright, the shape is slowly coming together. Next up is creating some little door hinges for these side doors. So I'm just going to create another cube and I can start blocking out those shapes. Alright, so next up is creating those little metal pieces that sit on the corners of the box. So I'm just going to make a little cube and scale that nice and small and start blocking that out. And I don't need to worry about making them all, I'm just going to create one for this little corner, and then after I'm done UVing it, I can copy it over to the others, just to make my life a little bit easier. Alright, so the Alchemy box is slowly coming together. I'm just going to go tweak a few things before I start moving on with the model. Alright, so things are looking a little better. Now we can continue on with the model. So next up is working on that lid. So to do that, I'm just going to create another cube, scale that nice and big just to fit over the top of the whole model, and then I can start refining that shape. Alright, so the box is looking good. Now it's time to move on to some of those smaller objects. So I'm going to start off with this little plate that sits on the top. Alright, so next up is creating a few strips of some test tubes that are sitting in the middle of the box. So I'm going to start off with creating a cube, just so I can block out that piece of wood that's going to hold them all, and then I can make a smaller lower poly cylinder just to boolean out some holes into this piece of geometry. Now I'm going to keep this on the lower poly side, that way when I press 3 on my keyboard I can smooth it out and add some divisions later on. Alright, so once those booleans are created and I have those holes in place, now I just need to go in with the multi-cut tool and start attaching some of these vertices. And really quickly before I do that, I'm just going to add a few edge loops on the side depending on how many holes there are. That way I have some points to attach those vertices to. Alright, so next up is creating the test tube itself, and that's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to go ahead and create another cylinder and I can start blocking out that shape. Now I do model the inside of the tube here, and it's not necessary, and actually end up deleting them later on. And there's a few ways I could have done this. I just did this the old-fashioned way, grabbed the edge and just extruded it inwards. Just like I created the outside, I'm just recreating the inside. A quicker way of doing this would just leave it one-sided, highlight all those spaces, and I can extrude them and give it a little bit of thickness. And I do that later on for other bottles in the scene, but to be honest, I should have just kept this one-sided since you're not really going to see the inside too much, and it would just save me on polys and just save me on time. So if you're going to recreate this, I would suggest and recommend just leaving it one-sided and then not worrying about the inside of the tubes because you're not going to see any of it. Alright, test tubes are in place. Next up is moving on to that big bowl that sits right on the front here. So I'm going to select another cylinder and I can start blocking out that shape. Alright, so that bowl and the little stick thing are all wrapped up. Now I can start moving on to the other shapes. So I'm going to start off with those books, and I'm not going to worry about refining them right now. I'm going to come back and worry about modeling them later. I'm just going to roughly block out a couple of cubes just so I can get those books into place. Alright, so next up is moving on to the bottles. Now I have a couple of different variations of bottles in the scene, and I do them all the exact same way. So I start off with a very low poly shape, and then I hit 3 on my keyboard to smooth it out, and then depending on the shape, I can just add some supporting edges where I need them. So I'm going to start off with the very first bottle just to show you how I do that, and then I do the exact same process to create all the other ones. And once again, modeling the inside of the bottle is not completely necessary. Now it would look pretty cool depending on what kind of glass materials I apply to this, so if you want to see the inside and add a little refraction or something along those lines, it would make sense. I probably could have got away with not doing this, and to be honest with you, during the UVing process I end up cutting and deleting a lot of the inside faces out, so just keep that in mind as I'm modeling all these bottles. Majority of the insides I end up removing. so next up is just creating a few small scrolls, paper scrolls that are just in the side door. So I'm just going to create another cylinder and start blocking that guy Alright, so for the bottle in the side door, I thought it'd be cool to add a little small object on the inside, so I'm just going to really quickly create some weird looking shape. I honestly have no idea what it's supposed to be. It's just something that fits in there, so under the liquid color that's on the inside of the bottle, you'll hopefully see something very small. And to be honest with you, during the texturing process, I probably could have put a little bit more effort into this bottle just to make it stand out a little bit more, because you honestly can't even see the objects on the inside in the final renders, but just something I thought would be a little cool, small little thing to add into the scene. So, and then I'm gonna really quickly add in another small cylinder just so later on in the texturing I could add some color and transparency to this so it can act as some sort of colored fluid that's inside of the bottle. Alright, so next up is creating some small tweezers, so I'm just gonna select the cube and start blocking out those shapes. Alright, so next up is working on the left cabinet. Now, I want it a little bit different than the one on the right. The left one, I want to have a bunch of different bottles or potions with a few small dividers in between them, just so it looks a little bit different than the right side and makes the model look a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to start blocking those out, and then I can start copying some of the same bottles I already created, just so I can start fitting them into this left cabinet. Alright, so the model's slowly coming together. There's just a few other shapes and models we have to do. So one of those is all those pieces of paper that are pinned onto the lid of this box. So all I'm going to do is create a few small planes, scale them all differently, and start positioning them on that lid. And once those pieces of paper are all in place, I can jump back to those books that we blocked out earlier, and I can start refining those shapes. Alright, so really quickly before finishing up the rest of my books, I'm just going to create a small spoon to go on my plate. So I'm going to create another cube so I can start blocking out that shape. I also thought it'd be cool to create some small little coins on the other side, so I'm just going to go ahead and create some cylinders, scale those nice and small, and then bevel out some edges. And then later on in Substance Painter, I can find a cool image online that I can print right onto the face. And then next up is creating a small box for the inside of that bottom drawer. Now this is barely going to be in the scene, so I'm not going to worry about adding too many polys or making it look too specific or anything like that. I'm just going to really quickly block out a few rectangles, one for the bottom and one for the lid, and I can scale this box really small to fit in that bottom drawer. And then I'm just going to reuse some of the bottles I've already created so I can duplicate them, change up the shapes very slightly, and start placing them in other areas around my box. I just want to populate this box a little bit more with other objects just to make it look a little bit more busy. Alright, so while zooming back out and taking a look at the model, I thought it'd be really cool to add a little label that was on one of the bottles. So that right side door bottle that we created with those small objects on the inside, I'm just going to create another cube and then scale that into a small little tag shape. Then I can just place that right onto the bottle so it just has its own label. Alright, so next up is creating some pins to hold up all of those pieces of paper onto my lid. So I'm just going to create another cylinder and then start blocking that out. Alright, so I thought it would also be pretty cool to add a few crystals or small rocks onto the model. I thought it'd just be fitting with the whole alchemy kind of theme going on. So luckily for me, rocks can be really random in shape and it doesn't have to be anything specific. So I'm just going to very quickly block out a few rock shapes and I can place those onto the model. Alright, so next up, I'm just going to select that small plate model we created earlier. I'm just going to duplicate that over and create a couple of stacks of them in that bottom drawer. So while thinking of other objects to add into my scene, I thought a plant or some sort of bush would fit the whole alchemy theme. So rather than creating one from scratch, because this model is already taking a lot longer than I thought it would, so I'm just going to take advantage of the content browser that's in Maya, and I'm just going to search for some sort of plant or bush asset that we can use just to throw in that top drawer. Now I'm not too worried about what it looks like, and honestly you probably won't even be able to see it in the render with the shadow since that top drawer is relatively closed, but I thought it would just be fun to throw something else in there. So let's go look in the content browser so we can find a small little plant. Alright, and now to finish off those remaining books. So there's a few small things that I wish I had time to add that I just didn't, and I'm just going to go over those really quickly before I wrap up the modeling. So the first thing that I wish I added was some sort of bead, necklace, or something along those lines that were hanging around some of these bottles. A lot of the bottles are looking pretty bare, and I thought it'd be cool to add different strings or ropes or different materials that were just wrapped around them. Another thing I would have added is some sort of necklace or something along those lines that were hanging from the pins that were on the lid. Since I have all those pins and there's not much going on over those posters, I feel like you can take advantage and add a lot of cool little small details to bring it to life. So there's a lot more I wish I could have added, and I definitely would have added if I wasn't doing this just over the weekend. I tried to keep these models under 2 hours, so you can only imagine that goes by really quick, especially when you're having fun. So it is what it is. So if you guys are going to be recreating this, that's just one of the small things that I think would make a big difference in the model and help bring it to life. Alright, so next up is creating a few tarot cards. Now I'm not going to create a full stack of them or anything, I just want 4 or 5, maybe 6 that are going to be spread out on that top plane. So let's go create a few small rectangles and I can start blocking those out. Alright, so that's it for all the modeling. Now let's just really quickly go over how I did those UVs. So now fast forwarded, this is the finished model in its finished form, and I'm going to show you exactly how I did these UVs. So I decided to break it up into 5 different texture maps. I decided to do one for the side boxes and the wood panels, and another one for all the other wood, like the main box itself. The third one was all the books and the labels, the fourth being all the glass and the bottles, and then the last one just being all the remaining objects. Now, this little guy in the top left corner here, I was a little bit lazy, just pretend you're not seeing this. It's that from the content browser, that plant that we used. I didn't feel like texturing it because it would have just been a mess and you're not going to see it, so I just pretend I didn't do that. I just squished it nice and small in the corner and we're just going to apply a color to it. So that's exactly how I did those UVs. Now let's just jump over to Substance Painter so we can start texturing. Alright, so now in Substance I can go load in my FBX file from Maya. Once that's loaded in and the model's looking good, I can just go over to my texture set settings, scroll down to Bake Mesh Maps, and I can choose my output size. I chose 4K, and then make sure to check on that, use low poly mesh as high poly mesh. And then you're ready to bake out your textures. Alright, so once those textures are good to go, we can start texturing. So I'm going to select my box 1 texture so I can start with the wood material. And I'm going to go into my smart materials, select one of those wood textures, and apply that to the mesh. Then I'm just going to open up that folder, start tweaking some of those settings until I find something that I'm happy with. Now, because some of these objects are taking up more space on my UV map, these 2 main panels that I'm looking at, the grains are a little bit larger than the other ones. So what I'm going to do is right-click this texture, set it to a black mask, and I can assign it to all the other wood materials in my scene. And then for the remaining other panels that I have, I'm just going to duplicate the same texture over. That way I can scale down those grains just to fit the other ones in the scene, and I can reapply it to those wood panels. Alright, so the wood is looking good. Next up is just adding a little bit of wear and some grunge on top of the wood texture. So what I'm going to do is create a fill layer, then I'm going to switch that into a black mask, and I can select all of the panels that I want to apply this grunge effect to. After that, I can go over to my masking tab and then choose a cool masking effect I want to apply on top of this fill layer that we just created. And then I can go tweak some of those settings and colors depending on how much grunge I want to show on my mesh. So I'm going to do the exact same process as I just did, create a few other fill layers, that way I can add a few more masks and some other details on top of my wood texture. Alright, so the wood is looking good. Next up is all those little metal pieces. So I'm going to go select another smart material, one of those bronze armor materials that come with Substance, and I can apply it to all of those other meshes in my scene and start tweaking some of the settings. Alright, so the textures are coming together. Next up is just copying these exact same wood and metal materials we just created so I can copy them over to the other wood and metal objects in my scene. So I'm just going to switch over to my next texture map and copy some of these materials over. Alright, so all those materials are copied over and things are slowly coming together. Next up is just starting to texture all of those little objects in my scene. So I'm going to switch over to my objects texture map and I can start applying different materials to those meshes. Alright, so next up is moving on to those plates. Now, I didn't find a material I was really happy with, and I thought some clay material would be fitting for these plates, so I jumped onto Substance Source on their website, just downloaded a clay material, and I just dragged that right into my project, set that as a base material, and then I can go apply it to my plate. Alright, so next up was moving on to my glass materials. Now, first up was those little test tubes. Now, to make that transparent, I had to go change my shader setting first so I can add an opacity channel. So to do that, I'm just going to go to the top right corner to my shader settings, and I'm just going to have to change my shader to alpha blending, and that's going to allow me to add an opacity channel that I can apply to this material. So if I go to my texture set settings and I scroll down to that little plus, you'll see that there's an option now to add an opacity channel. So I'm going to go over to my smart materials and select one of these glass visors. Now these already have this opacity channel connected, and since we changed our shader, that's going to allow that opacity to actually show. So all I have to do is just click off the dirt in this texture, and then I can actually see through it. At this point, it's just a matter of tweaking some of these settings until I get something that I'm happy with. Alright, so that glass material is applied. Now it's time to just add some other materials to the other remaining meshes. Alright, so for this coin, I just hopped on Google and found an image of an old, ancient sort of coin, something that just looked cool, and I just basically saved that as a PNG or a JPEG. I threw that into Photoshop and inverted the colors just so I can throw it into my Substance project as an alpha. And then all I have to do is just add a height channel to this material, and then I can just paste it on directly onto my mesh depending on how much of an indent or a bump I want to have on this coin. Alright, so most of the objects have materials applied. Next is just moving on to all that glass. So just like we did those small test tubes, I'm going to do the exact same process to all the other glass materials in the scene. The only difference is I'm going to be adding a few different fill layers like we did to the wood, and adding a few different grunge effects on top of the glass. So let's go ahead and start texturing all these glass objects. Alright, so the only difference between all of these glass materials is this large purple one on the bottom here has a pattern on it. And to do that, I just decided to go to this textures tab, find some cool pattern that I thought looked fitting for the object, and I just applied this to the height channel. And then just tweak some of those settings so I found something I was happy with, but just to give this bottle something a little more unique, make something stand out, make the whole model a little bit more interesting. Alright, so all of the glass is done, time to move on to all of those labels. Now, I quickly jumped onto Google and found various images of Alchemy or things that were related or things I just thought were fitting and cool for the model. So I went on earlier and just saved a bunch of images to my desktop, and then I just dragged those in individually and assigned them as textures. And all I'm going to do is just find these different shapes on my UV map and then just paste these textures directly onto those meshes depending on where I want those labels or images to go. So let's start tackling all of these images. Alright, so all of those labels are finally applied. Now it's time to just jump into the render to see how things are looking. So really quickly off the bat, I'm just going to remove that background and just change a solid color, and I'm going to raise that floor height to match the bottom of my model. Then I'm just going to tweak some of those lighting environment maps or the direction of the light just to see how all these textures are looking, just so I can really quickly jump back into my editor and start making some adjustments. So all I'm going to do here is just quickly tweak some of the colors and settings, and then also add a few other grunge effects on top of this wood just to make it look a little bit more used. And then you'll see me jumping in and out of the renderer as I'm just making some last quick adjustments to the model before I take that final render. Alright, so that's basically everything. That's the whole texturing and modeling process that I did to create this Alchemy box. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more weekly 3D content. And if you feel like supporting the channel even further, as well as getting access to additional content, check out my Patreon account, which I will link in the description below. Other than that, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.